Morning, guys. This is take two because apparently my recording uh, app decided it wanted to not do what it was supposed to do. So hopefully this will work this time. Um, so we only got a couple days left, obviously. So I'm going to start winding down. The next 2 days we're going to spend on this, which is really short, really easy. Um, it was just something I felt was both relevant to what we've been talking about and also short enough that I could tack on kind of at the end there. I'm not really planning on doing anything next week, so we can spend that time uh, to get kind of grades put together and everything like that, and also just to hang out and say our goodbyes and all that stuff. So um, we're just gonna go through this. I'm gonna go through the notes today. There won't be any questions for today, and then tomorrow I'm just gonna ask you for examples of each of what I'm going to talk about. So that being said, in addition to this, just make sure you're getting things squared away. Make sure you're checking grades, all that fun stuff. But usually you guys are more on top of that than some of my other classes. So um, that's not to say that you shouldn't do that, but just you get what I'm saying. Either way. So what we're going to talk about today are threat levels of extinction. So doing what we did all last week with conservation, looking at population sizes in the field. What scientists can do with that information is make some descriptive claims about the health of the population based on the data they collect. So based on the changes that they see, kind of like what you guys did, they can determine certain things about the population based on drops in population size. So we're just going to go through some terminology for today. This will look familiar if you took my PBL. We talked about this last year for that PBL, so it should be fairly easy if you already had that. But we're going to look at some vocab terms today. So first area is of least concern. Organisms that are not at risk, don't present any potential things that might place them at risk, so on and so forth. They are widespread, abundant, you can find them everywhere, and they are doing fine, and there's nothing potentially on the horizon that could put them at risk. Some good examples obviously are humans, animals, or domesticated animals like dogs, cats, cows. We breed them. There's plenty of them. They're all over the place. You can find them everywhere. A lot of insects do very well. Not all of them, obviously. There are some endangered bug species, but a lot of insects do very well. Houseflies, for example, are abundant. They're everywhere. They outnumber us by the millions or billions. Unfortunately, you can find them everywhere. Next is near threatened. So with this one, you have not seen any actual drop in population yet, but there are factors at play that are likely to put them at risk for population loss. So, for example, the rainforest wildfire last year or the Australian bushfires last year, it's been a rough year. The reason why those were such a big deal, obviously, aside from the people that were placed at risk because of those things, but also you saw, especially with the Australian wildfires, you saw how the animals were being displaced. You saw all these animals who were losing habitats and that were going to be impacted by this wildfire. So again, we didn't see any, for the most part. I mean, obviously there was a lot of death with some animals, but for the most part, you didn't see a huge impact on the species. The impact is going to come later when there's no habitat for them to return to, and you start to see the populations dying off. So even though we haven't seen the drop off that this has caused yet, we know that it probably will lead to a drop off. So this is when you're placing them at near threat. We know there's something that's causing a change in their environment that might place these animals at risk. Vulnerable species is the next level up. They're considered to be vulnerable when they meet a couple criteria. First is species growth rate, which we learned how to calculate growth rate a couple days or a couple weeks ago. Has decreased by 30 to 50%. Area that they occupy has decreased by a notable size. So again, looking at our transects, so if you notice that in the same transect that you've been looking at for a very long time, you start to see less and less of them in that transect. They could qualify for a vulnerable species. Population size has decreased by 10% within 10 years. A couple examples are the red panda and the African elephant. That's pretty much it. You guys know what those are. Next up is endangered species. Everyone's heard this term before. Endangered species means that a species growth rate has decreased by 50 to 70%. Population size has decreased by 20% within 5 years, so very big drop off in a very large amount of time, or in a very short amount of time, sorry. A couple examples are the giant panda, the monarch butterfly, and the leatherback sea turtle, and this is for a couple reasons. Giant panda is, I believe, due to poaching and hunting. I think people hunt and poach pandas, but I could be wrong. But another big thing that leads to endangered pandas is because of their gestation time. Pandas take a very long time to be born. I think it takes around almost 2 years. I'll have to fact check it, and you can fact check me if you want, but I'm pretty sure it takes almost 2 years from conception to birth for a panda to be born. And on top of that, they have a very narrow breeding window. So if they miss that window, then they're not going to be able to breed for a whole other year, which makes it very difficult. That's why it's such a big deal whenever you see them born in captivity. You've probably seen like headlines about like panda born in Chinese zoo on this day, blah blah blah, or something like that. It's a very big deal when it happens. Monarch butterflies are mostly due to pollution and habitat loss, and we talked about why that's important with pollinators and how they play a role in the environment. The niche, going back to terminology that they occupy, and then the leatherback sea turtle, I believe, is also due to poaching for their shells. I could be wrong though. Critically endangered species are when their population size is decreased by 80 to 90% within 10 years, and they're very difficult to see in the wild. Sumatran tigers are a good example. Black rhinos, Amur leopards, those kinds of things. Extirpated is probably a word you haven't heard before, again, unless you took my PBL last year. But we actually looked at this example last week with the conservation assignment. Extirpated means that they are extinct in a given location, meaning you can no longer find them there, but that doesn't mean that they're extinct globally. So perfect example, like we looked at last week, the gray wolves in the Yellowstone National Park. The gray wolves were extirpated for decades in the park. You could not find gray wolves in the park. That does not mean that gray wolves were extinct everywhere. Obviously, that's not the case. But you could not find them in Yellowstone National Park until, again, they're reintroduced later. So they were extirpated. They are gone from that environment. Extinct in the wild is exactly what it sounds like. It means that you can no longer find them in their natural habitat, but there are species that have been placed in captivity that are being raised. Usually by this point, they're too far gone to completely save. It's very, very difficult to save a species from this point with such low numbers. I may have happened in the past. I could be wrong. I don't know of any specific examples, but usually this is like the last stretch where they're most likely going to go extinct. A couple examples are Panamanian golden frogs and then Lonesome George, which I don't know if you know Lonesome George. It's from a couple years ago. He was a species of Galapagos tortoise that they called him Lonesome George because he was the last of his kind. He was a big tourist attraction for a while, but sadly he died in 2012. I don't think he's the last Galapagos tortoise ever, obviously, but for his species, I believe he was the last one. I could be wrong. I don't remember the exact story. It's been a while since I looked at it. And then next is extinct. Everyone knows what extinction is. When there are no more organisms in that species in any part of the world ever, they're gone forever from the face of the earth, never to return. Which sounds like a bad thing, and it is in a lot of cases, depending on what goes extinct. We talked about keystone species and what the impacts they could have are, but keep in mind that extinction is a natural process. It happens a lot. It happens all the time. 99.9% of all species that have ever existed have gone extinct, which would make sense considering that the Earth has changed a lot throughout the course of living things being on it over the 3.4 billion years that there's been life on this planet. Organisms that can't evolve or can't adapt go extinct, and the organisms that can evolve and can adapt will survive. So obviously the organisms that we see today are a lot different from the organisms that we see, or we saw, or know existed. Nobody saw them 65 million years ago. It's a very different planet. Famous examples are the dodo bird, obviously passenger pigeon. I don't know if you know that one as much. Tasmanian tiger, dinosaurs, obviously, anything that lived more than however many years ago, depending on the species. The reason why we're concerned about this so much today, since I know that I was just talking about how that's a natural process, but the reason why this is such an issue is because with the amount of human impact that we're seeing and the amount of changes to the habitats we're seeing, we are at risk for a large extinction event where multiple species go extinct all at once, which is most likely going to be a very bad thing, because when you are losing so many species in such a short amount of time, that's going to have huge impacts on all the ecosystems around the world because of how many species you're losing, and that's going to really impact the living species. We've seen in the past the ramifications of mass extinction events. There have been several throughout history, the most famous being of the dinosaurs, but there were some even before that, and the worst one that we ever experienced was millions of years before that, even when organisms first started producing oxygen. But I'm getting off topic. I just find this stuff interesting. So that's really it. Mostly just vocab today. No questions for today. I was going to save that for tomorrow. What I'm going to do tomorrow is I'm going to post a website where you can see different examples of these terminology turn out. I don't know. You get the idea. You just have to give me an example of a species that falls under that category and tell me why. It'll be super easy. But anyway, so I want to say thank you guys. I was thinking on making like a full like wrap up video, but I'll just say thank you for putting up with all this. I know this has been a completely unprecedented year. I know it's probably not been ideal in a lot of cases, but you guys have done a really good job of staying in touch and communicating and staying positive, at least I hope. I haven't seen any negativity for the most part, which is good, and if you have some, that's fine. It's an interesting situation. But you guys have done a really good job with it. I really appreciate it, especially the seniors. I know this is probably not how you envisioned your senior year. um, but it's gone fairly well compared to what I mean, not I was expecting it to go awfully, but in terms of how well it could have gone, I think this went probably about as well as it could have. So thank you guys for that. I really appreciate it. If you're still wrapping up the conservation assignment, make sure you're asking questions if you have them. I know it's past the due date, but I'd rather it be turned in late rather than never. So let me know if you have any questions with that. I'll still plan on hosting the there's a goose outside. I'll still plan on posting the Kahoot, not Kahoot, I can't think anymore. The Zoom for tomorrow. The goose distracted me. I don't know if there will be that many questions. Feel free to ask me if you have them about this. I don't think this will be that difficult, but you can ask questions if you have them. And then I'll post another Zoom for next Wednesday since it'll be the last day. I know there's nothing to do, but I figured just in case people want to come and say hey and goodbye and all that stuff. But either way. So yeah, I've rambled for long enough. I'll let you guys get to work today. So thank you guys. Have a good day. I will see you tomorrow.